Hello and welcome back to Two Peas in a Pod for another fascinating discussion. I am co-host Aaron Herskovitz here with
other co-host Sam Liebens. Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you, Sam.
Today we're going to be about money and possession and all things related.
Yes. Also, we'll hopefully focus on generosity and tzedakah too.
Generosity, yes. That's a nice segue into the Torah section that I was hoping to share with you, Aaron, and our listeners. Today I brought a text from my Rabbi, Rabbi Sachs, from his book To Heal a Fractured World. And in this part of the book, it's a chapter called Charity as Justice. He is meditating on how counterintuitive it might be to the non-Jewish mind that our word for charity in the Jewish world, tzedakah, really means something like righteousness or justice, right? Tzedek Chevrati is social justice, right? So tzedakah has to do with rightness and proprietariness, if that's a word. Whereas in the non-Jewish imagination, in the Western imagination, charity is about generosity of spirit. It's about going beyond the letter of the law. It's not what's demanded of you by justice. It's going beyond the letter of the law is the notion of charity. Now, Judaism does have such a notion of going beyond the limits of the law.
I think it's interesting, though, that in the difference in the English and Hebrew phrase of that concept, that in English you're going beyond the letter of the law, and in Hebrew you're going within, right, closer than the line of the law.
Right, you're going within the line of the law.
You're getting to the essence, I think, also part of it.
It's about getting the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. The word for this in philosophy is the supererogatory, means things which are not demanded of you by ethics and law, but that are nice to do. And I think the non-Jewish translation of tzedakah as charity very much places charity within the supererogatory, within the beyond the letter of the law, whereas the Jewish conception of charity as tzedakah, as righteousness, as justice, is kind of counterintuitive, potentially. So Rabbi Sachs writes the following. A later sage noted something strange about the geography of the Holy Land. He doesn't say who the sage is, but there are two seas in Israel, the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. The latter is full of life, fish, birds, vegetation. The former, as its name suggests, contains no life at all, yet they are both fed by the same river, the Jordan. The difference, he said, is that the Sea of Galilee receives water at one end and gives out water at the other. The Dead Sea receives but does not give. The Jordan simply ends there. To receive without reciprocating is a kind of death. To live is to give. The story is told of the great 15th century Jewish diplomat and scholar Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, Chancellor to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Castile, that he was once asked by the king how much he owned. He named a certain sum. But surely, the king said, you own much more than that. You asked me, Abarbanel replied, how much I owned. The property I have, I do not own. Your Majesty may seize it from me tomorrow. At best I am its temporary guardian. The sum I mentioned is what I have given away in charity. That merit alone, neither you nor any earthly power can take away from me. Rabbi Sachs concludes, we own what we are willing to share. That is tzedakah, charity as justice. I thought it was a very pretty meditation on charity as justice.
The true ownership is the ability to give.
Well, it's almost like what you really own is what you've done. And we'll talk about this more in the philosophy corner in a while. Money, you could think of as a potential. It's a potential to buy stuff. It has purchasing power. But all the money in your bank is just unspent potential. What you really own, the Abarbanel wants to say, is what you've done with the money you've had, right? And if you've done things for the good with your money, you've given to tzedakah, you've helped people, then that's something you really own, you take with you. The money in your bank account is just potential good deeds or potential spending, but it's literally unspent potential. What you really own is what you've done, was the second thought in that piece. The first thought is that if you're only a recipient of funds, I suppose if I took in lots and lots of income, but I never spent anything, then eventually I'll die, and that unspent potential will not have been used by me at all. It's in the spending of the money, it's in the use of the money that you, I suppose, make good on your potential. And not to put too fine a point on it, you purchase your share of the world to come.
That's interesting. I like that idea. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
We're recording this year right before Shavuot, even though we're going to release it a little bit after. And that means that I have the mitzvah of Bikurin on my mind, of bringing the first fruits to the Beit HaMikdash. And I remember a number of years ago when I was preparing a shiur on this topic, and I recalled an earlier story back when we used to live in Alon Shvut, where a friend and neighbor had a car. And I overheard him once, someone asked him, "Can I borrow your car for something, to go do something?" And the friend said, "It's not my car. It's not mine. Feel free. Use it and enjoy it." I don't think this was his intent, but one could have thought that what he was saying is that really it's not mine at all. Or is that this kind of personal property is not something that I connect to. God gave it to me, and that's it. Right? He didn't give it to me. I happen to have the keys, so I can give it to you also. And I think that that's not necessarily what the message of Bikurim is. That if we look at the command to bring the first fruits to the temple, to the Beit, part or an additional bit of a debate, but at least part of the mitzvah or an additional mitzvah is not just to bring them, but to also recite these verses also when you bring them. And if you look very closely at the psukim, there is this movement between plural and singular language, so that when at the beginning of the command, we're told that when you come to the land Hashem has given you, you're supposed to take from the first fruits, and the verse says, "Asher tavi me'artzecha," you singular bring from your land, also singular. And there's certain halachot that we learn from this, which is what, in general, the shiur that I gave was about the fact that, for example, the land must be owned by you. It must be a land also that can give fruit and all sorts of other things. So the land needs to actually be yours as an individual, not yours, the collective. And then when you bring it, you recite, like I said, a number of verses. And what you
declaration.
Pardon?
This declaration.
Exactly. And the declaration begins in a very national way, right? It starts off talking, I came to this land that God promised, latet lanu. And he promised to our fathers to give to us. And then later on, it talks about the history of the Jewish people. The Anita Vamarta, you singular must say. And then we, the nation, called out to God, and Hashem heard our voice, and he saw our suffering, and Hashem took us out with a strong hand, and outstretched arm, and he brought us to this place, and he gave us this land, the land flowing with milk and honey. And now, now I have brought the first fruits of the land that you gave to me, Hashem. And then you leave them. In other words, there's this transition. There's this back and forth between it being collective and between it being
you
individual.
and us and me.
Exactly. And at the very end, the last verse is, you must be joyful with all the good Hashem has given you, singular, and the Levite and the convert or the stranger who is in your gates. In other words, I think that going back and forth is intentional. I mean, everything is intentional, but I think that part of the stress also is that we need that duality or the dialectical tension almost between, on the one hand, recognizing that it is mine, right? These are my fruits. God gave them to me, and because of the fact that he gave it to me, therefore the joy that I'm supposed to be expressed is not just a joy of me in my home, but it's supposed to be a joy for the others who are less fortunate, who don't have us. That's part of what there's a package deal. Because if it's just God gave it to us, then fine. Then it's not minorities. Nobody's going to take any responsibility for it. That we can go too far in that direction. But that we need that duality between recognizing what's ours, but also recognizing it's given to us for a certain purpose too.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I think that relates to some of the practical things.
It does. And well, I was again debating as you were whether to bring this in, but since I've started the debating in my mind, I think I will. There's an interesting distinction in Jewish law between metaltal, that's movable property, and karka,
chattel, right?
Chattel, movable property, and real estate, which is not movable. I have a whole shiur about how the movable property is more yours in a sense than a real estate can ever be. There's this whole idea of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch really goes to town on this, that your metaltalin, the movable property you buy and you own, are kind of an expression of who and what you are. You think about like you buy clothes to express yourself, think about all the chick-chacks and knick-knacks you have in your home. They kind of express your personality and tell a story about who and what you are and your history. And he goes on and on about how when a thief steals such things, they're pogeya on the person himself. They're actually hurting the person himself because the person, so to speak, extends into his or her metaltalin. But karka, as I was speaking this week in Shul, we're recording this, as you said before Shavuot, we just read Parshat Bahar B'chukotai. And land ownership, you only get to own the land for 50 years at a time, or you only get to sell the land for 50 years at a time because it's periodically redistributed. And God says, Ki li haaretz, because fundamentally the land belongs to God. And this, I wanted to suggest, creates a dichotomy between the metaltalin, which are like really yours, and the land, which is yours in inverted commas. But I think, what's that verse? You
wanted to?
No, there are two verses in Psalms. One is Shamayim Shamayim Lashem v'ha'aretz natan livnei adam. Right. God has given the world to us; it belongs to us. But there's another verse in Tehillim says, "To God is the world and all of its inhabitants." Right. So, which verse is right? Does God own the entire land and everything in it, or has He given it? Has He given it to us? Has He relinquished His ownership over it? And I think that there are various answers to that. The famous Gemara in Masechet Brachot that says that nothing really belongs to you until you make a bracha over it. Right? So you've got your banana and you're about to eat it. It really belongs to God. But then you make a bracha over it and then it becomes yours and you can eat it. But the Hasidim, Rav Tzedakah Cohen and others, play around with these verses and say it's just different levels of reality. At the deepest, most fundamental level of reality, everything belongs to God and always will do, and nothing can undermine that fact. And then there are some less fundamental layers of reality: social reality, political reality, legal reality. And at those levels of reality, we can talk about private ownership. This land belongs to you, this land belongs to you. So when you get that deep, there's not even a distinction between metaltalin and land, right? Everything is God's. Anyway, so I felt
think
like
that's also by our Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Donal, one of his earliest books of lectures and talks that he gave is called Haaretz Natan Livnei Adam. In other words, it's a demand, right? Like God gave us land. In other words, that it's our responsibility. It entails a certain level of responsibility also.
So what I like is the Dvar Torah I started with from Rabbi Sachs about charity as justice was maybe focusing on the sense in which we don't really own anything apart from our ma'asim tovim, our good deeds. And your reflection on Bikurim was potentially could be read as a rejoinder, because it says, no, like God gave the land to you and you have to do certain things with it, and you have to it's a potential, perhaps a conditional gift, but it's yours. And I suppose I'm trying to wrap it up by saying that both of these perspectives are true. They operate at different levels, perhaps, of reality.
Yeah. I guess it makes sense. We're right before Shavuot, so the Torah corner is just so full.
So full. Okay, but let's move on. Psychology Corner.
All right. So I think it's so interesting, this topic in general about money and generosity and tzedakah, because the topic of money can really trigger people.
Yeah.
I think when meeting with couples before they get married, I officiate at weddings through Zohar, and one of the set questions that I ask is, what does becoming married mean for you? What's changing? It's for so many of the people, I think almost all of them, they're already living together. They're not moving, or they're going to physically, everything is going to be the
And
same.
what's changing?
Yeah. So I mean, almost all of them say now we're starting a family, right? So that's usually a big answer. But in the way that a lot of like general society works is that nowadays the last step that people take to come together is having a joint bank account. That they'll live together, move in, live in the same place, but still keep the finances separate. And I think that's just the sign of like what the biggest step of trust that people need to take nowadays is combining your finances with someone else. That's the most difficult thing to do. I think that part of it is because that money really triggers all sorts of very like early and primal things for us, because it symbolizes a very primal need. Our earliest needs are protection and from external danger and being fed. And money is a stand-in for that. Or it's money. Yeah. Money can purchase goods and services. And for that reason, discussions about money and tensions around money, it often causes us to encounter those very strong and primal urges. And also it can bring up a lot of intense negative emotions too, because it can trigger all sorts of fears around survival, around things being taken away from us, of being harmed. And on the flip side, also, it can trigger intense shame over a feeling of like greed. Like if I've taken too much and now what is it? Or how are other people going to view me? How is that going to affect other people? The fact that I've taken so much now, there's nothing left where I took it from. And I think that's why this topic is so important, because of the fact that often couples struggle to discuss finances, and even more so than when parents try and teach the topic to their children, it also becomes more difficult psychologically.
I think there's also a sense of injustice. Sometimes people look around them and see people who are much wealthier than them and who have creature comforts that they don't have, and creates a sense of envy or a sense of entitlement. I'm just adding into the mix some of the psychological insecurities that finances.
Yeah, I think that's really, the concept also of envy and jealousy, which when we had like a whole episode on jealousy, I think, right, in season 1. And I don't remember what I spoke about from the psychological corner, but I would assume that I spoke about Melanie Klein, who writes about those different emotions and how early they come in development, right? That the baby, what the baby feels about the mother who provides nourishment, and the baby wants it all for themselves. Yeah, and that's in our Torah study too. I assume also we spoke about the story of Cain and Hevel. I don't remember. We can all review that episode. Everyone go listen to it after this one, right? One of the earliest story of siblinghood is centered on the theme of jealousy. But yeah, I think that's a good addition. Thank you very much. So I wanted to speak, Dafka, about two different theories that are not from the psychodynamic world. One is called social learning theory, which is by a psychologist named Albert Bandura, who was, I didn't know this, but he was born in Alberta, Canada. I don't know if that's where he got his first name of Albert from, who was named for his province, in 1925. And he did a lot of research in Stanford University. And what he did was he added a lot of different cognitive aspects to the prevalent behavioral theories of his time. And when one of maybe his most famous experiment is what's called the Bobo doll experiment in 1961. I remember seeing a grainy video of this back in AP psychology back in high school. But they took this like big blow up doll. In Hebrew, I think it's called the Nashum Taku. I don't know if it's called Bobo doll, and it predates our childhood by a couple of decades. But it's this inflatable doll, and you hit it, and it goes down and comes back up. You hit it down. So in his experiment, he put the children in different situations, and adults behaved towards the doll in different ways. Right? Some of them, I don't remember all the different conditions, but some of them basically acted very violently towards the doll, and others did not. And then the adult I think, left the room. And then the child's behavior towards the doll was observed. And the children who witnessed the adults behaving violently, sadistically towards the dolls then tended to mimic that behavior as well. And this was a change in the behavioral approach, because the behavioral approach felt that behavior is instigated because of reinforcement that we've provided to a child. In other words, if a child has hit a doll and we've taken away something nice or introduced some type of punishment, so then that behavior will presumably not appear. And if it acts a different way and re-encourage that behavior, give the child a reward, then that behavior is going to be encouraged. So here, the child was merely an observer, and the adult did not also, right? In other words, it's not that the adult received a reward or a punishment for acting in a certain way. So there was no reinforcement here that on the behavioral level. It was merely through the model, through the mimicry, the way that the child saw the adult act towards this doll, the child acted as well, more likely to act as well, which introduced the fact that so much of our learning is not just from direct experience, but also by watching others. I remember my childhood Rabbi, Yitzhak Pursky, talking about his experience learning karate as a child and how much he enjoyed when he wasn't the one who was picked to volunteer to be shown a new move by the instructors. It's so much easier to see them making the mistake and you learn from that, so that you don't have to do it yourself. He has like a number of different concepts that relate to this social learning theory. One, like I said, is in terms of modeling and observational learning. The children observe other people's behavior, internalize what they see. And there's an important relational aspect to this as well, that if the child admires or is close to the person who's using a certain type of behavior, or even if they see them as an authority figure, they're more likely to imitate that behavior as opposed to someone that there's no connection to, or the opposite, that they feel negative emotions to, then you're less likely. You're more likely to do the opposite of what the people you dislike do, which is, I think, also when we've spoken about adolescence too, about how some of adolescent rebellion can make a difference in terms of the relationship that parent and child have established. That if the relationship is a negative one, it's more likely that the adolescent will behave in a way that's contrary to their parents' behavior. It doesn't go both ways, right? It's not that, if an adolescent is acting in one way, then that's because of a different negative relationship. Another concept that he speaks about is vicarious reinforcement. The children notice not just the behavior, but the consequences. And it's not just that they perceive themselves the reinforcement, but that someone else received the reinforcement. Like I spoke about in terms of, the karate story, right? If you see someone else getting a good result out of something, so you're going to also perhaps learn from that. And in his later work, he talked about a concept called self-efficacy, where his focus was that if a child feels that they have this ability to make a difference, that belief can really make a big difference.
Self-efficacy, you say?
Yeah. But the feeling that one is capable of making a difference, and how important it is to develop that ability. And so that's his theory in terms of social learning theory, and I think that it also relates to money as well in terms of modeling behavior, in terms of learning from others, but maybe we'll talk about that more in the practical. I don't think social learning theory specifically relates to money and giving charity, but I think that it could be applied in those areas. That's why I wanted to mention
So you're laying down social learning theory as a background to parents modeling generosity and fiduciary responsibility to their children.
Yeah, I think that's laying the groundwork for the practical order.
Yeah.
And the other theory that I wanted to mention, I think, is more directly connected to issues of money and charity. There's another psychologist named Lawrence Kohlberg, who was born around the same time as Bandura, 1927. He was strongly influenced by Jean Piaget, where he wrote about 6 stages of development. What's it called? From the, how should I call it? What was it called? Stages of moral development. Sorry, that's the name of the model. And he wrote that the moral development proceeds along 6 stages, which he splits into three sort of parts. The first stage of the pre-conventional, we start off range around 4 to 10, more or less. And we start off following the rules because of a need for obedience is demanded, or we're worried about punishment. And then it slowly transitions to self-interest. In other words, why do you not do this? Because I know if I do it, then my mom or dad are going to punish me. They're going to be angry. Or why did you do something good? Well, I thought maybe if I play with my friend, then they're going to play with me later on. If he agrees to me to do this, then later on I'll agree back. Whatever. That's the first stage. That's the pre-conventional phase. The second out of the three larger stages are called the conventional stage, which is like around the age of 10 till 13 or so, where it switches that the moral development, it becomes more motivated by social approval and then later on by law and order. In other words, that I follow the rules because I'm not. We spoke about this in terms of how in adolescence, the connections with others become so integral. So this also is a part of it, right? I want others to approve of me. It's sort of another form of reinforcement, or also similar to how Pirkei Avot, when Chazal talk about the importance of having a system of government, is because of the fact that if it did not exist, that people would swallow each other alive. In order that we need rules. We need rules for society to function. But that's the end of that second stage. In the third stage, he refers to it the post-conventional, which is later teens and adults, but not all people reach this level, is that what it focuses on in the two different stages within it is this idea of a social contract, that the rules exist not just to protect, right, because without rules it would be chaos, but that rules exist to protect people's rights, and also this concept of universal ethical principles. I'm doing these things because they're just, even if they're not popular. And so this part of it, I think, also is something that we could potentially apply to the concept of charity. In other words, why are we giving tzedakah? Right? You're giving tzedakah as a child because my parents are happy, they encourage me to do it. If I don't do it, they're going to get angry. But then as time goes on, they do it because it's the right thing. But it is very intellectual or cognitively based, his model. So there's a later theorist, Martin Hoffman, who added another layer to Kohlberg's model in terms of the moral reasoning. And what he argued was that empathy is actually the core motivational force behind the moral behavior, which Kohlberg had not mentioned as much. It's more cognitively focused, like I said. And this is more about the development of a feeling of empathy. That when kids are young, when they're babies, they experience a sense of global empathy. And is that if someone is in distress, then they're in distress too. Right? We see that, if one baby, in the daycare group starts to cry, then the others will cry as well. Not out of a sense of connection, just bad things are going on. So I'm also feeling that bad things are going on. And then later on, for toddlers, there's egocentric empathy, where toddlers will try and comfort others with what they themselves would want. Which is very sweet, right? When you see an adult experience or another child experiencing them, the toddler will come and give them their pacifier or the dummy, right, or a stuffed animal or a blanket, right? Even though the adult has never experienced and never expressed any interest in those things, it's sweet. It's still focused on, oh well, I enjoy this, so I assume that you will also. Later on, we get into role-taking empathy from the age of preschool, where we're able bit by bit to imagine other needs more accurately. And then later, there's empathetic concern in later child, that where you're acting out of a genuine sense of care for someone else's suffering. So that within Hoffman's model, also the concept of giving develops as well. And that for younger kids, maybe similar to what I mentioned with Albert Bandura, they're going to be because adults do. When kids get a little bit old, they'll do it because they want to be good. And then older kids and teens maybe because they are starting to really understand the concept of suffering, identifying with a person and wanting to actively help them also on their level. That's what I have for the psychology corner.
Well, very good. It's a lot to think about. It lays the ground for the practical corner to come.
I hope it does. I actually started this time preparing with the practical stuff, and then I said, "Oh,
I see.
I'm still supposed to talk about psychology." That's kind of my job title.
Well, I look forward to the practical corner.
Me too. The philosophy corner.
Okay, so there's a lot one can speak about here. One thing I'm not going to focus on, I'll just mention, is there's a question about what money actually is, a philosophical question about what money actually is. The two main theories are the commodity theory of money and the credit theory of money. Basic idea was, in a barter economy, a transaction only occurs where you have something called double coincidence of wants, meaning person A needs to want what person B has and person B needs to want what person A has in order for a barter to take place, right?
Right.
And that's those coincidences like that are not going to be very common, and that's what makes a barter economy cumbersome, inefficient, and that's why we move to money. And according to the commodity theory, money is any object that serves the following three, or that plays the following three roles. One, it serves as a medium of exchange. Two, it's kind of it has a unit of account, so you can count how much there is of it. And three, it stores value. And it used to be the coins themselves were made of valuable metals, so it's just a valuable
gold
commodity.
Standard in the U.S.
The gold standard,
awesome.
And the gold standard stopped in the 1970s. So what the gold standard meant is that paper money got its value from the fact that anybody who had paper money could transfer it for gold. Right, the government promised, it was a promissory note, the promise to give gold on request. Right. But that stopped. And one of the things that the commodity theory of money didn't explain very well was inflation, and about how the value of money can go up and down. That shouldn't happen if money is like the standard by which you execute transactions. So the credit theory of money thinks that coins and notes are merely tokens of something much more abstract. They think about money as a social construction. It's not a real.
I was just going to make a joke that money is just a social contract.
Well, that's right. Well, it is.
Social construct.
So-called social construct.
I'm going to tell that to my creditors.
Right. The money doesn't get its value. The money doesn't get its value because, it's gold or it's silver. The money gets its value because of the role it plays in the society. And that
it's kind of scary when you think about it, no?
It is. It becomes all the more apparent that the commodity theory is false. The commodity theory says that the money just is the value of the coin itself, of the item itself. Once the gold standard finished, the government doesn't promise to replace any note for gold in Fort Knox or wherever it may be. Where does that piece of paper get its money from? It gets its money from the role it plays socially, and it's something like a promise, right? It represents a credit relationship, so it represents a promise from someone to grant or repay a favor, a product or a service, to the holder of the token, and it's exchangeable. But anyway, this is what I'm not going to speak about, the philosophy of money. It's a fascinating question. It's a fascinating question what money is, and I have no clue what the answer is. And I know philosophers to this day debate exactly about what money is and how it gets its value. That's not what I wanted to speak about.
Is that more a rabbi trick or a philosopher trick to talk about what you're not going to talk about for a number of
it's one of the parts of the Venn diagram of rabbinics and philosophy. It's talking about what you're not going to talk about. I think it's fascinating thinking about what money is and how it gets its value. But like I said, I don't know what the right answer is to many of these questions. You
didn't even get onto crypto.
Well, exactly. I'm going to move straight on. I'll say that for a long time there was this thing called Chartalism, which thought that only nation states, have the ability or the right or the whatever to create money, but cryptocurrencies show that to be not true, I suppose. Anyway, that's what I'm not going to speak about. What I do want to speak about is equitable distribution of wealth. Right? How is wealth distributed across a society? And there are two philosophers I want to speak about, just briefly to fill the philosophy corner. One is Robert Nozick, and the other is John Rawls. They were colleagues at Harvard University. They were colleagues and friends, but had quite different views politically. One, Robert Nozick, was a kind of intellectual backbone to the rise of neoconservatism in America. So he was a conservative, libertarian-leaning philosopher who probably quite influential over Reagan and that whole period of American social and fiscal policy. John Rawls, on the other hand, was much more of a kind of social democrat, kind of centre-left, woolly liberal political philosopher. They had tremendous respect for one another and were great interlocutors. So the contribution from Robert Nozick that I want to share with you is called the Wilt Chamberlain argument. Now, I didn't know who Wilt Chamberlain was until I learnt this argument, but American listeners of a certain age will probably know. He was
I think of any age will know.
Of any age, okay. So he was a great basketball player.
Any sports fans, yeah.
He was a great basketball player and was probably at the time that Nozick was writing the highest paid sports person certainly in North America, or he was well paid for his skills. So the Wilt Chamberlain argument goes like this. It says, imagine a society in which wealth is distributed however you may think is the most fair way to distribute it. So if you're an egalitarian, make sure everybody has the same amount of money in their bank account. If you think, no, that's not right, people with more children should have more money, or people with disabilities should have more money, or people with greater needs should have more money. You sort out the money across society however you think fit. And we'll call that the initial condition. The initial condition is whatever you think is fair. Okay? What Nozick wants to demonstrate is that we're going to be able to move from that initial condition, the one that you choreographed, coordinated. We're going to be able to move from that initial condition to one in which there are gross economic inequalities. And we're going to move from the initial condition to gross economic inequalities only through the informed, consensual transactions of well-informed adults. So nothing unjust is going to happen. We're going to move in just steps from your initial conditions, and we'll get gross economic inequalities. How? Well, all that has to happen is Wilt Chamberlain has to say, I refuse to play basketball unless everybody who comes to watch pays $5 extra, and those $5 extra go straight to me. It would be highly illiberal to say that we have to force Wilt Chamberlain to play basketball if he doesn't want to play basketball. That would be unjust, to force him to play against his will. And likewise, as long as he's made this a completely transparent decision, he's saying, I'm only going to play if the people who come to watch are going to pay $5 extra. And nobody, we're not going to force anyone to come and watch. If you don't want to come and watch, you can stay home. But Nozick suggests people are still going to want to come to watch basketball. And they are informed adults, and they consent to give $5 extra. And Wilt Chamberlain has made this demand, and it doesn't seem like it would be, it seems like it would be very illiberal of us to interfere with this demand. What's going to happen is very quickly Wilt Chamberlain is going to be richer than everybody else. And
he's not using coercion. He's just using light pressure, or establishing a standard on his salary.
Not even light pressure. He just says, like, I don't have to play. If you want me to play, right, then you have to put $5 on extra on the tickets, and no one has to buy a ticket. Everyone can stay home if they want. And what Nozick thinks he's demonstrated is that the only way to stop inequalities emerging would be to interfere with the free decisions of grown adults. The only way to stop inequality emerging in this scenario would be to force Wilt Chamberlain to play basketball whether he wants to or not. Well, that's highly illiberal. Or it would be to force people not to come and watch Wilt Chamberlain play. So you can't come and watch him play, it's going to make him richer. That's not fair. Well, that's also highly illiberal. The only routes by which you're going to stop inequality emerging are highly illiberal, seemingly highly unjust routes. So Nozick says, we're just going to have to suck it up and accept that economic inequalities are not ipso facto unfair. It turns out Nozick is completely willing to accept that much of the wealth inequality in the world today is unfair. White people in America are still the beneficiaries of the chattel slavery that ended a couple of hundred years ago. The poverty of many African Americans can be put down to the slave of many generations ago. In Britain, many of the landed gentry, descendants of people who just stole land from peasants. I mean, so there's a lot of inequality, financial inequality, that is unfair. Nozick would completely accept that. But his point is, inequality itself isn't unfair. grown adults should be allowed to spend money how they want. Transactions should always be based on the principle of informed consent. And as long as there is informed consent on the part of both transacting parties, you don't have any liberal grounds upon which to complain about the emergence of inequalities. And I think this philosophically,
that outcomes can be unequal. I think that's referred to as
that's right. Outcomes inequality.
Yeah. I mean, it's partially it's a big political debate now, also in America and elsewhere too, in terms of equality versus equity.
Yeah,
equality of opportunity versus equity outcomes, things like that.
Absolutely. So the reason I bring Nozick's Wilt Chamberlain argument to the table is Judaism does think of, as we said in the Torah corner, charity as justice, that we have an obligation to give to the poor and to alleviate the suffering of the poor. But the Torah doesn't imagine a society in which there are no rich and no poor. The Torah doesn't imagine a society in which there's complete equality of outcome for all people. And Nozick can help us get a handle over why that might be. Why, in fact, it sounds like, everyone should have exactly the same amount in their bank account. Surely that would be the most fair distribution of human wealth. Turns out that no, that's not as simple as that. If you want to live in countries where people have the freedom to engage in transactions, there will be inequalities, and that's not necessarily an evil.
Yeah, John, I think we're against the lyrics of Imagine, John Lennon.
Exactly,
right? Imagine if there's
no possessions,
right? No greed, no hunger, brother and man.
Yeah,
I don't think it's true either.
Not fans of that. I'm not a fan of greed or hunger. But you have to recognize the Wilt Chamberlain example is trying to show you, if you want to enforce equality of outcome, like resource egalitarianism, if you want to enforce that, the only way to do that is going to be by taking away people's civil liberties. And that's not a route I think we should want to walk down. John Rawls, Nozick's colleague, has this famous thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. He asks people to imagine that for a few minutes or a few hours, they are to stand behind this thing called the veil of ignorance, which takes away their knowledge of whether they're male or female, whether they're able-bodied or disabled, whether they're wealthy or by birth or not. Basically, you lose all knowledge of who exactly you are in society. And then, from behind the veil of ignorance, you have to agree to a set of laws or principles that are going to govern your life once you come back out the other side of the veil of ignorance. So one thing you're going to want to make sure is that there's no racial injustice in your country, because you don't know if you're the racial majority or the racial minority. What Rawls thinks is the self-interested decisions of people behind the veil of ignorance would lead to a just legal system. Because behind the veil of ignorance, you're not going to want to live in a sexist patriarchy, because for all you know, you might be a woman. Behind the veil of ignorance, you might agree to there being an inheritance tax, because you don't know whether you've inherited stuff or whether you're one of the unlucky ones who doesn't have any inheritance at all. The decision, again...
It's like a prisoner's dilemma here.
It's a bit like a prisoner's dilemma, but the idea is the self-interested decisions of people behind the veil of ignorance are going to dictate what ends up being just or unjust. And one of the interesting things that Rawls concludes when thinking from behind the veil of ignorance is he imagines a few different economic scenarios. One is in which everybody's quite poor, but there's very little inequality. Another economic scenario is when there's massive inequality, but the poor are, relatively speaking, quite rich compared to other scenarios. Obviously, if you could choose behind the veil of ignorance an economy to live in, you'd want to live in one which has the lowest inequalities and the most wealth, if you possibly could. But what Rawls comes to recognize, this is called the difference principle. He says, don't bother about inequalities. What you need to be sure of, you've got to be careful, because you don't know whether you're the poorest or the richest. So what you should be advocating for behind the veil of ignorance is any economy in which the poor are best off. That's to say, if you've got 4 different economies, one with high qualities, one with lower qualities, one with high inequalities, one with low inequalities, one where people are rich, one where people are poor. Find the poorest person in each economy and go for the one where the poorest person is, relatively speaking, the richest, if you understand what I mean. Richer than the poorest person.
The richest poor person you could find.
Imagine that in all 4 economies, Bob is the poorest person.
Yeah.
Choose the economy where Bob is richest. Choose the economy where the poorest are best off.
In statistical terms, where the minimum value is the highest.
Exactly. And it's called, this principle is called the difference principle. If you want to look at how just your society is, don't be too bothered. And this is something Nozick could have agreed to. Don't evaluate the justice or injustice of your economy by inequalities. There could be an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates who have billions more dollars than anybody else. That's not what's going to make your economy just or unjust. What makes your economy just or unjust is how poor is your poorest person. And I think that's a very interesting thing. I think Judaism would be interested in that, because we have a social safety net for the poorest of the poor, ma'aseh ani and whatever. We look to the poorest in our society to see how well off we really are, how just we really are. So there you go.
I think that's very important. Thank you for sharing those different viewpoints.
Thank you. Oh, so now,
the practical corner.
All right. Wow, lots of interesting psychology and philosophy today.
Yes.
I think that when we talk, we really have like a number of different topics here. We have one is in terms of educating children about money, the role money plays in life, how we manage money, how we're responsible for it. And as part of that discussion also is in terms of how we relate to others who we might give that money to. An interesting concept of charity, of generosity. I'm going to talk about some of the different aspects of it, but I don't know if this practical corner will be exhaustive in terms of all the different aspects that are probably worthwhile to discuss.
When I think about this topic, I think it manifests at different ages in very different ways. So when you were talking about parents of the very young, when toddlers learn to share their toys, right? That can be a massive trauma for some kids, right? Learning to share their toys. Whereas teaching your teenager who has their first job and is earning money for their first time, teaching them to be fiscally responsible, that's a very different parenting task to the parenting task of teaching a toddler to share. But they're all part of this topic, this broader topic of money and charity.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the themes that are relevant in both ages are number one of responsibility. Yeah. And we're talking about the older child, so it's fiscal responsibility. With the younger child, it's also responsibility. Take care of your toy. Don't throw it on the floor. Don't break it. Yeah. If you break it, you won't have it anymore. And together with that is the idea of the sharing, which is relevant also at both stages.
And interestingly, part of what it means to take proper care of your toy is to share it, potentially, in the same way that part of what it is to be fiscally responsible is to give the right amount to charity.
That's a nice reframe. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
I guess I'd always thought about it as a separate thing.
You play with your toy. You share your toy. This is all part of your responsibility over your toy. You know?
That's interesting. It's a nice idea.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think in terms, maybe I'll start, since you mentioned the emotional difficulty that young children especially have with sharing, is right. We don't. This is getting back to what we spoke about with regards to negative emotions. Also, we need to first, see the child where they are at. And recognize that it is difficult, right? In other words, that you say, oh, what does it make a difference? Like, let him play with the car for a second. What difference does it make? Because for you as an adult, you have different, hopefully, are more generous than your child, but you don't necessarily understand from an emotional level, from an emotional perspective, what it means for your child to share that car. That for them to share a car is a lot more difficult than you think it might be. So firstly, it's important to recognize that the child might have a more difficult time overcoming that variant. For them, it is more difficult to share than others. And that some of it might stem from a certain level of insecurity about what's theirs. So sometimes it's what you spoke about before in terms of, right, in the Torah corner, the connection with the possessions, right? That the possessions are an extension
part of you,
the third Torah corner. Yeah. So for kids, that can also be, in other words, so that can be a part of it, but also not really knowing, is this mine or is it not mine? Because if I'm not playing with it, then maybe it's not mine at all. But I don't know if it's mine. The only way I can read needs to be a very physical expression of ownership. It's mine because I'm holding it. If someone else is holding it, they are challenging my very ownership.
My ownership, yeah.
It might also be like a certain, sometimes for kids, like possessiveness can also be to a general sense of insecurity. We spoke about in the past how children need to have things that are predictable. And if there's other things going on, life is just whatever. Parents in Miluim, parents in reserve duty, you've just moved, mom's away on a trip, whatever it is. So it can trigger a reaction where all of a sudden I need some more predictability and structure. So children, they respond in ways that indicate more possessive.
I wonder whether one practical tip that comes from this observation is with very young children, as they share the toy, as the other person is holding it, you could still call it's Moshe's toy, right? So, Sarah, are you enjoying playing with Moshe's toy? And that gives Moshe affirmation that it's still his, even though it's in the hands of somebody else.
Yeah, I think that can be very beneficial for both sides.
For both sides, for the Moshe and the Sarah.
Yeah. And I think that's something also important for parents of young children to keep in mind when you're thinking also about some of the difficulties. Maybe we haven't really spoken about this as a separate topic, but it's rather that when more kids are being born, so that also can be something that you can use as a tool to help the older siblings cope with that feeling of a loss of space and specialness in the relationship. Also, it's not to bribe them or buy them off, right? That's just right. So if I'm losing some of my space within the family because all of a sudden there's a baby around, so to bring this, there are things that are yours, right? Whether it's time that we still have, things that we do together, or you still have a special relationship, and sometimes it's the toys, right? And we see this sometimes a lot of times with older siblings, why they can get so triggered when a younger sibling will touch something is because back with the story of Leah and Rachel, right? Was it not enough that you've taken my husband and now you want to take the dudaim that my son has brought too?
Exactly.
So that can be triggered sometimes also. So to be aware of that. And I guess, okay, so if we're talking about sharing and generosity, maybe I'll just continue with that.
But this goes back to the notion that ownership isn't evil. Judaism doesn't have as like a negative view of ownership. These things are yours, and that gives you a sense of means to express yourself and to feel comfortable. And
and I think that there's a certain balance and tension that can and should exist within the family in terms of that concept of individuality with collectivism. And I think that's also true with regards to possessions also. We try to get a certain level of balance. I don't know if we have the right formula, but I'll mention it as practical because I think that everyone needs to at least consider it between children on the one hand having certain special, unique toys versus things being general, right? And every family needs the right formula for that. So, in some families, it's like, okay, if there's 20 stuffed animals that exist within the family setting, you can choose one that's yours.
It's
right? If you get another special one, okay, fine. Then you can only have one. I don't know if you need to be that rich. You can have whatever number, because of the fact that especially stuffed animals can be so symbolic. We spoke earlier about we spoke in a previous episode about fears and anxiety, the transitional objects. So often stuffed animals can be that for children. So they do have a lot more important symbolic nature too. So to be aware of that. So sometimes it could be about a certain number, and sometimes it can be also, where did this come from, right? So if something was received as a gift from a grandparent for a birthday, whatever. So maybe that makes it more special, as opposed to other things that are going to be general presents. They belong to everyone. But also things can sometimes go through transitions as well. And in other words, I was just thinking about it with our kids this week, right? So yeah, that was something you got for your birthday 5 years ago. But, in our family, like in certain points, so an individual's birthday present maybe becomes, it's still yours in the one sense, but it's not that every time someone wants to use it, they need to ask your permission. But you have a special relationship with it, but it's not always to the exclusion of anyone, looking at it either.
Yeah.
And I spoke about how we have magnet tiles in our home, and we bought that. Actually, I don't think we bought them. They were given as a gift for our oldest when she was 2, and now she's 13. So I gave it as an example to the younger kids. Like she was the only one in the family at that point. So it's hers, right? So no. And I think she's also mature enough that she's okay with other using the kind of dial stick. But there's sometimes things that go through transition. And when we talk about sharing, so it's two things, right? One is like in the story you gave, right? Sarah using Moshe's toy, right? It's still Moshe's, but you're giving, giving that opportunity for others to use it as well. And part of the sharing is giving up the ownership also almost complete. In other words, it's not mine anymore. Sometimes it belongs to the family, and sometimes it belongs to you. And we see that also with our older kids too. And that gives them meaning, right? So when a younger baby is born, so sometimes it can be hard, right? I wouldn't encourage parents to think of ways, what do you want to give to the baby? Because that isn't great. But we notice that some of the kids at different stages that they take a stuffed animal and give it to the baby. They give it to Shaked because they also, giving is also a source of meaning, right? And positive feelings also. And it's something that we encourage and view positively. I think we've always encouraged in the sense like, what do you want to give? Or something.
I think we've all had the experience of kids going to a birthday party and finding it a little bit hard to let go of the present that they're supposed to be giving to this, because they'd quite like it themselves. But that is an important learning experience, the experience of giving something that you would quite like, really giving it to another. Yeah.
And now that we've spoken about that, I think that also there's been a couple of times where we've winnowed out some of the toys, and there was a specific need. There was a family that needed toys, so that was an opportunity also for us with the kids to reflect on ownership and on giving. Like, okay, thank God. God has given us so many wonderful things. And we actually have more than we could possibly need. So there are people out there that don't have as much. Let's look through things and think, well, what would either what do we not want anymore because we're going to get it, or what do we think would give joy to these other people also? And reflecting on our own memories around these toys, and also how we hope that others can use them as well.
This relates back to your social learning, because it's not just that you give them these opportunities to give, but they're part of a family initiative. Your family as a whole is giving to some other family in need or whatever, and you're both showcasing, involving your children in processes of giving.
Yeah, I think that's important too when we talk about, because up until now I'm mostly speaking about items and objects, which are more important when the kids are younger. Also when they're older too, but like you mentioned before with regards to the job, so as kids get older, and in terms of the transition also between different forms of economies too, we start talking about money. Right, so we started talking about money. So I'll talk first about the giving before the budgeting. But that's also an important practice for kids to learn through money. Right, so one way to do that is that different families have different practices, but one nice practice can be to give tzedakah before Shabbat begins, before lighting the Shabbat candles, so that not just the mother or the parents doing so, but the children do so as well. And have giving tzedakah, charity, being a part of celebrations. In other words, that if a child, let's say, for example, received a gift of money, so to teach them about the concept of giving 10% to charity, and saying, wow, this is incredible. You have this opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah. What cause do you want to give to?
Yeah, that's one of the things we do. Whenever we receive, if I receive a windfall from, it never happens, but from
Monopoly when you receive it.
No, but from some of my books, you get royalties every year, and sometimes you get just about enough to buy a copy of the book that's been earning you this money. But when I get like a royalties check that I wasn't expecting or something, I do use it as an opportunity with the kids. Oh wow, I've got 10% to give to what charity should I give? What charity should I give to? And when the kids earn money, that's a part of the conversation. But we make it part of the excitement of earning. Is that, oh wow, not only have I earned 90% of what I've earned, but I've also earned the ability to give 10% to a charity. Which charity shall I? And there are so many different worthy causes out there that you get to express yourself in terms of the cause that you choose.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And also related to that, you can have the opportunity to help frame any personal or family celebrations also as a way to give to others. That is, if you're talking about a birthday party or some type of other celebration, to think of a way to add another level where there's giving. So they have, for example, bar bat mitzvah projects where there's a chesed aspect to it as well. It's thinking of not just receiving gifts for yourself, but what gifts do you give to others And I think that that's also can be incredibly.
So this means that
important.
you're trying to wire. I mean, you don't want to make it sound too clinical, but it's almost like you're trying to wire in their head of your children the notion of earning with the notion of giving. These two things come together. You earn, you give. Or celebrating and giving. You celebrate, you give. These things need to come naturally together. That they're two sides of the same coin, to use a...
Yeah, very much. When the Rambam talks about what true joy is, right? The command to experience joy at the festivals, he distinguishes between the joy of one's stomach, where they're just with them and their family, filling their gut with the pleasures of this world, as opposed to a meal in which one is invited those less fortunate to join with them as well. Which is what true joy is supposed to be. Yeah. Okay, so those points I wanted to mention with regard to giving, but also in terms of the money and responsibility aspect, which I think, like you were saying, maybe go hand in hand. Yeah. So one thing that adults should be doing is budgeting, right? Treating their money responsibly. And there are families, the parents learned it by themselves. There are other families where the parents learned it from their parents. And be also important. I think that is important for parents to pass that along to their children also. Helps them be aware of the fact that we budget, right? We plan things out. We don't just, it's not just money comes in, money goes out. I don't know what's going on, but that we're also responsible about it. I think it's important to discuss that with children only in age-appropriate ways, right? So,
of course, and your children can start to worry about your financial security, and you don't want your children
right. Yeah, you don't. I mean, I've had enough clients come, or kids, whatever, where they've shared that children will, and not necessarily because of anything wrong that the parents did. It's just that getting back again to that previous episode of childhood fears and anxiety, that sometimes children can pick up on half things, whether they're accurate or not, and make a whole big thing. Oh, we don't have enough money because I bought a chocolate milk, so we're going to be thrown out of our apartment. Right? Things like that. So it's important to be aware of children's tendency to certain children to catastrophize.
As they get older,
also as they get older, but even when they're younger, right? So say like, thank God has enabled us to have money, which we use to buy all sorts of things. But we want to make the good choices about it, right? Because I could take all my money and buy candy. But firstly, that won't be so good for my body. And secondly, then I won't have any money left for the other things that I really like too. Right? So I need to be on top of things and plan things out and be responsible about it. And we have that sometimes our kids will get various money gifts. So we talk to them about, okay, well, what do you want to get? Oh, if you get this, is that something that's going to last you, or is it just going to be like a one-time thing? Do you want to split it up amongst different things? We notice these different dynamics that from amongst the different kids, right? The children who want to get like 10 different gifts, 10 different things that each cost like one shekel, right? All these cheapo toys that are going to break into 1 week, as opposed to like, no, I'm going to save onto it, right? I'm going to, 15 years from now, I'm going to buy a really great present for myself. Those different dynamics that different kids bring into the picture. But to help them be aware of the importance of planning, the importance, delayed gratification, of being responsible, but also not needing to be sagpani, to be ascetic, to deny yourself constantly. It's important to learn to enjoy in a responsible way too, and a grateful way. And I think as part of that also, the big discussion about giving in allowance to kids. Which I think is an important way to also help teach them about the value of money, about budgeting also. There's different schools of thought in terms of how to frame the allowance. So the pros of that approach are that you teach like an exchange of goods. In other words, you're teaching them similar to with a job. In other words, you put in something.
The money doesn't grow on trees. Money doesn't grow on cheese. You have to earn it.
Yeah, but the danger in that approach also is that it makes things like feel transactional in your relationship with your kids, which is not the type of relationship that most parents want with their children.
And that danger can manifest in terms of your child will refuse to do anything unless it's for money. That's not
right. And so that's not the environment that you want usually in your family. You want people to be putting things in out of a sense of care and responsibility,
sense of duty and care and responsibility.
Yeah, I'll do it for you if you make it worth my while. Right? That's not what you want things to be saying. And this approach, has that in there. And the other approach is to say that okay, well, there's a weekly, monthly, whatever it is, like allowance, which grows over time. In today's digital economy, there's different ways. Do you give them actual money, or do you put it somewhere? Which the risk of that also is that they don't necessarily know the value of money. It's not something that you can see and feel and touch. It makes it a little bit harder, but it is more practical. Like I almost never have cash on me, and so on the one hand, that's positive, right? You're teaching them responsibility, but the drawback of that approach also is that it can create this feeling, like you're saying, that maybe is growing on trees, right? I get money, just because I am
entitled to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that also, there is a danger in that approach also. I think, whichever families could choose which approach makes the most sense to them, I think. But I think that it's important to have one of them and try and mitigate the potential negative aspects of each side. But the goal is to teach responsibility, to teach kids to plan things out, to also help them understand a little bit about the value of money and what it can do, and how to treat it responsibly, and also treating it like
to be impulsive.
Part of the responsibility is also giving.
Yeah. Very nice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, there we go. Is that another week wrapped up?
I think so. Another successful episode in the books.
Wonderful. In the books.
Have a good week, everyone.
Take care. Bye.